Welcome to Tower Talk Business Radio, where we bring you conversations with the top business minds on Long Island and around the nation every week. Featuring expert consultants and small business owners who have found success but are also willing to share their top tips, failures, and give gritty, matter-of-fact advice based on their firsthand experience. Now, let's get down to business on Tower Talk Business Radio on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello and welcome to Tower Talk Business Radio. My name is Ray Schwetz, AVP of Business Banking at Jovia Financial Credit Union, along with Denisha Boston Hill, CEO, keeper of the brand market and digital agency, and we're focused on bringing the premier resource for business and entrepreneurship. Plus, we bring you weekly business advice, tips, tools, and services that help you grow your business, and we interview top leaders in the industry. We've had the fortune of interviewing a few creatives in business over the years, and I'm absolutely ecstatic about our guest today because I'm a huge fan. I've enjoyed his work. He gets to play in a lot of really cool sandboxes like Star Trek and the Marvel characters and his own awesome characters. So I'm welcoming today our guest, author Michael Jan Friedman. Mike is a New York Times best-selling author with more than 60 books under his belt. He's also written for television, comics, radio, and although he's a literary rock star, he's also a local Long Islander, and he makes time for giving back to the community. We met at the CP, the Cerebral Palsy Nassau mini-con, and I was thrilled that he agreed to be on the show today. So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
First, why don't you share a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, and how you got kind of bit by the writer's bug?
Sure. I grew up in Bayside, Queens, in a middle class enclave, sort of carved out of Alley Pond Park, and which was great because the park ran behind my house, right behind my back fence, and it kind of gave me a little bit of a playground for my imagination. So that was great. But I didn't know anyone who was in the publishing industry. Every father in my neighborhood was in the garment center or maybe in real estate or something like that. Nobody even knew anybody who was in publishing. So I knew that these books were published, and I knew someone wrote them. It was just a completely different world, even though it was taking place 10 miles away in Manhattan. And I was a voracious reader from the time I was little. My father was a voracious reader. My mother read a lot, and she was very creative. So I think that just rubbed off on me. And at some point I said, I love being the person receiving, on the receiving end of this creative work. But I think I'd also really love being the person on the production end. I just didn't know how that was going to happen. It was a dream, but it wasn't anything I thought would actually take place.
And so that made you want to become an author. But how did you make that leap then, from making that dream become a reality? Well,
I didn't expect anybody was going to read it, but I just naturally wrote. I said, this is great, but I think I can do this too. And maybe not nearly as well as the authors that I was reading. I was reading Ray Bradbury and Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote Tarzan and some other stories. Also, some science fiction writers that might not be easily recognizable, like Poul Anderson and Roger Zelazny, who, if you're a science fiction reader, you might be familiar with these names, but these were inspirations to me. And so I was writing stories. It was just nobody was reading them. I was, from the time I was very little. And then in college, we had Isaac Asimov come to visit. Isaac Asimov, who even then had written over 200 books and was a distinguished science fiction writer. And I asked him, do you do this full time? Because it sounded like he did. And he said, yes. And I was like, there's a guy in the world who writes science fiction full time. That's amazing. I mean, I didn't think I would be in that position, but it opened my eyes a little. And I said, no, there are some opportunities here. And this was the first time I'd ever met anybody who wrote, who got paid for writing. So it inspired me to write. And I wrote, I used independent studies in college to write a novel. I used 3 independent studies. And it was very gratifying. But again, nobody was really reading what I was writing. And then I had a friend in college whose family had a literary agency. And this was also amazing to me that somebody had a company that hooked up writers and publishers. Like, great. And he said, because he admired some writing I was doing for in the school paper. It was a daily paper, and I was writing a weekly humor column, which was pretty well received. And he said, Mike, when you write your novel, and you will, you come to me, because by then I'll be working for my father and my grandfather, and you come to me. And so I did. When I wrote my first professional level, what I thought was professional level novel, which was a swords and sorcery kind of fantasy, I went to him and he read it in no time. And then he got back to me and he said, Mike, this could be the next great science fiction classic, or it could be a pile of horse manure. I really have no idea. I don't read this stuff, but let me send you this to an agency that does. So I called them up and they said, well, we're not looking for any new authors. And, I'm a New Yorker, so I'm a little pushy sometimes. So I said, well, aren't you looking for the next Stephen King? And they said, well, actually, we're very happy with the current Stephen King. So I had stumbled onto Stephen King's agent, and I could see why they weren't interested in me. But I said, is there another place you can send me to? And they did. They sent me to an agency where they were looking for new authors, and they did work in the science fiction and fantasy field. And they liked my, they liked my book. And the woman there, who I was dealing with, a woman named Karen Haas, she said, I really like this. I want you to add a little bit here and a little bit there, like another 40 pages or so. And we're going to take it to publishers. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. This is beyond what I ever thought. And she did. She took it to the first publisher she took it to was Warner Books, which was coming out with a new fantasy and science fiction imprint called Questar. And she called me a couple of days later. She goes, Mike, I have good news. I sold your book. And I was speechless. I couldn't believe it. So all of a sudden, my life had changed. And I remember walking, I had a job working for a magazine. And I remember walking back to the subway. It was a few blocks to the subway, and feeling as big as any of the skyscrapers. It was just an amazing feeling. And then about a week later, she and my editor took me out to lunch at a nice Italian restaurant. And my agent, being a good agent, she said, so the way this was written, it kind of invites a sequel. So would you like to see a sequel for Mike? And the editor, a lovely woman named Kathy Malley, said, yes, I would. I'd like to see a sequel. When do Mike, do you think you could do that? And I said, oh yeah, a sequel. Now it had taken me 2 years of weekends and after work and so on to come up with the first novel. And my and the editor said, yeah, could you? It was April. She said, could you have that by August? And I went, I'm thinking August, like of what year? And I said, oh, well, August, you mean like? And my agent kicks me under the table and she goes, Mike can do whatever you want. And I was like, wait, what? 4 months to do a book? So I had I had a job, and I couldn't take time off to work on a book full time. So what I did is I made a life choice, and that I never regretted. And I said, I'm going to cannibalize my job. I'm just going to sit and write a book at work. And, I went to the bathroom a lot and wrote longhand in the stall, and came in late, left early, just whatever I could do to get this book going. And after a while, my publisher called me in and said, the publisher of my magazine, and said, Mike, not for nothing, but you really haven't done anything here for a while. And we negotiated an end to the job, which was okay too, except I'd have no income. And I finished the book. At that point, I left a little room at the end again, and my editor said, "Well, looks like we're headed for a trilogy." So at that point, I was necessarily freelance at that point. So I said, "Sure," and I ended up doing 4 books for Warner, 3 in the trilogy, and then 1 freestanding book, all grounded in Norse mythology. That was one of my passions.
That's amazing. So now take us on that journey. Let's jump ahead a little bit so you're writing your own material now. I'm not sure what happened here. Did you get approached by companies like Marvel or Gene Roddenberry? And how did you kind of get mixed up in that world and get to play with those cool characters? Well,
so at the end of that 4th book, what happens is in publishing is editors come and go. Mm-hmm. And this particular editor, who was wonderful, she retired, and I'd done 4 books for her, and they all did reasonably well. They were all in the ballpark of what you'd expect, but none of them were breakouts. And so she retired, and I became what we call in publishing an orphan. Mm. And the next editor came along who had no real commitment to me, and said, he called me in and he said, Mike, you had a good run. We had 4 books, they were all great, but, you're a mid-list writer, and I think, we're going to need to make room to give the next guy a shot. So take care. I was like, what?
Oh, wow.
That it? Is that it? That could be it. I could be done. And it wasn't such a terrible thing, because I never thought I'd publish 1 book, much less 4. So, it was depressing, but I was being realistic, and I wasn't going to give up, but I thought maybe that's it. Maybe that's all I get. And a few days later, fortunately, before I jumped off a bridge, a few days later, my agent called and said, "Have you ever thought about doing a Star Trek book?" And I was like, "Yeah, well, me doing one? Yeah, maybe." I mean, I'd read some by people like Ann Crispin and Howard Weinstein, and I enjoyed them, but I didn't really think I'd be doing one. So I said, "Yeah, I'd love to do that." So she hooked me up with the editor, a guy named Dave Stern, and I sent in a proposal with the original series characters. That's all there were at the time. It was only the original series. And I spoke to the editor after I sent in the proposal, and he said, "Mike," he goes, "this is exactly what we're not looking for." It was a proposal based on Scottish mythology, and Scotty, the character Scotty, was kind of the protagonist, and he said, no, we're trying to make it look like science fiction here, so don't do that. I want to give me a science fiction proposal. So I did. I went back and I based a proposal on an original series episode called "What Are Little Girls Made Of?" That introduced the idea that there was a rogue scientist who was creating androids, and actually created at one point an android version of Kirk. And that always stuck with me. That was always intriguing. So I said, I'm going to base my proposal on that episode. It's a sequel. And in the proposal, an android version of Kirk takes over his Enterprise and gets rid of him, unbeknownst to everybody on the ship. And he's kind of got to fight his way back to the Enterprise. And I sent that in, and Dave Stern said, "This is great. I really love this, but how does it end?" And I said, "Oh, I didn't put that in. I didn't want to ruin it for you." And he goes, "Mike, I'm a professional. You can ruin it for me. I can't okay this till I know how it ends." So I put in the ending, something with Romulans and an encounter with Romulans, and it all fit together. And he liked it, and he sent it to Paramount. And the way it worked in those days is you had to, Dave was the gatekeeper. He worked for the publisher, and then there were two offices at Paramount that had to approve any project. One was the licensing department, which was very staffed by good, intelligent people who if they had to disapprove some element of what you were doing, always had a suggestion. Well, we can't let you do that, but how about that? And it was always a good suggestion. So that worked out well. But then there was Gene Roddenberry's office, and Gene had a guy there who was basically a fan and didn't have the kind of vision that they had in the licensing department. And he would disapprove things, not just for me. In fact, I got away pretty easy, but there were other writers who were just decimated by his responses to their proposals. But anyway, that's how the process worked.
You are listening to Tara Talk Business Radio. Our guest today is author Michael Jan Friedman. My name is Ray Schwetz on the voice of National Community College, 90.3 WHPC. So I know there are certain rules and restrictions with regards to writing franchise characters. And you had mentioned to me when we met that you kind of had an interaction with Gene Roddenberry. Is that something you could talk about?
Oh, well, it was only by, well, let's see. I think what I might have been talking about was the God thing. Gene wrote a script for the original Star Trek movie that came out in the late 70s. Mm-hmm. And it was rejected, even though this was his series. It was rejected on the basis of a lot of things. It was rightly rejected and not used. And then they came up with another script that had some elements of what he'd suggested. And that became Star Trek: The Motion Picture, the first Star Trek movie. But he wanted to, or he passed away. I actually didn't have interaction with him when he was alive. But after he passed away, the editor at Pocketbooks said he wanted to take this script and make it a novel. And he suggested that maybe all I had to do was flesh it out and add some material around what Gene had established. Pretty much the way you would do with any novelization of any screen product. And I read his script, and it didn't do a good service to his memory. Let's put it that way. It was awful. And at one point, it was called The God Thing. The premise was that, our gods were aliens, and now these aliens were coming back, and they wanted to take back our world. And so, it wasn't particularly original. It had elements of it, as I said, had been used already in the movie. And some of it was, there was a lot of midlife crisis stuff going on in there. And at a critical moment late in the book, Captain Kirk is having one of his trademark, knockdown, drag out fights on the bridge of the Enterprise with Jesus Christ.
Oh, wow.
So I said, this is not, if I were Gene Roddenberry, this is not the thing I want I'd want people to remember me by. So I said, I can't just write around this. I have to take as much of it as I can and preserve it. And I made an attempt to do that. I wrote a proposal and a couple of sample chapters, and Gene's, the people who were in charge of Gene's estate said, no, it's not what we have in mind. We really just want to do what he wrote and just embellish it here and there. And I said, I couldn't do that. In the end, no one could. The book never came out. But that was really my only real contact with Gene, and he was already deceased at that point.
Well, it sounds like you were protecting his memory and doing a good job for Star Trek fans there.
Yeah. Nobody was going to be happy with that book.
So, obviously, I mean, you've been in the industry for a very long time with, writing numerous books and, 30 plus Star Trek novels, an amazing run. And now the publishing industry has changed so much, and you're still doing a lot of work, and it's wonderful to see. Can you talk a little bit about how the publishing industry has changed and what sort of things you're doing now to kind of keep up with that?
Sure. About 15 years ago, I saw that the industry was changing. People weren't reading as much, and as a result, publishers had to publish more books to reach their financial goals, but the profitability was less because each book wasn't selling as well as it had, and so writers were kind of taking it on the chin. Our advances for a given book were maybe 3/4 or even like just half of what they had been, and the ebooks had been introduced to the marketplace, which further diluted the potential for each book in sales. And I saw the handwriting on the wall. Things were not going well, and then that was confirmed when Borders Books went out of business. Big chain, out of business. So things were, I could see things were heading in a bad direction, and I wanted to preserve the link between reader and writer, because that's where the magic is, right? I mean, publishers have been great over the years, but they're not essential. And I wanted to make sure that there were still people reading and writing science fiction. So I got some of my friends together, my professional writer friends, and we created a group called Crazy 8 Press. And the premise of Crazy 8 Press is that we were publishing books that traditional publishers might not be able to publish. Traditional publisher needed tens of thousands of readers to justify publishing it, and maybe even more than that, maybe hundreds of thousands. And we didn't need that because our profit structure was different through BarnesandNoble.com and Amazon.com. It was a different structure, and it was much more in our favor. So for the science fiction writer, these were not good developments. But for the science fiction entrepreneur, publishing entrepreneur, there were actually some opportunities there, because the publishers, the traditional publishers, no longer had the means of production exclusively. They no longer had the means of distribution exclusively, because anybody could write a book and at least in email form, in ebook form, they could produce and distribute it. Anybody. So that was an opportunity, I thought. So along with the challenges we were facing as writers, there was an opportunity, and we kind of jumped on that. And Crazy 8 Press, it was I and a bunch of other excellent writers, and we over 12 or 13 years we've been around, we've got an inventory of about 80 books. We've been productive, and we've been able to get our books out to the public, even though there are changes. There are continuing to be changes in the publishing community. So that's gratifying, and it's, we have a following, and it's great to be able to do that, and to publish the visions that are really most important to us, the ones that don't have to be as commercially viable as the ones put out by traditional publishers. I'll give you an example. I went to before 2012, which is when the Mesoamerican calendar turned over, right? The Aztec apocalypse. I thought, well, let me write an alternate history book about a 21st century Aztec empire, and this apocalyptic point in its history. And I decided it was going to be a murder mystery, kind of a noir murder mystery. So I went to a science fiction publisher where I knew the editor, and I said, so I've got this idea for a 21st century Aztec Empire noir murder mystery. And she said, that's a great idea. I'd really like to read that book. I can't buy that book because, can you imagine taking that to a bookstore buyer? Yeah, it's a 21st century Aztec Empire noir murder mystery. The buyer's head would explode. So she goes, I can't buy it, but yeah, if you write it, send me a copy. So at Crazy 8 Press, the second book I did as a member of Crazy 8 Press was the first book in my Aztec Empire, 21st century Aztec Empire noir murder mystery with series. It's now a series. So these are the kinds of projects that you can do, that we can do at Crazy 8 Press, that would not have been possible at a traditional publisher.
And that's amazing. And as a fan looking for that type of material, we appreciate the work that you're doing. Now, we have to come to a close. I could talk with you for hours. But as we come to a close, can you please tell us where we can find your books and more information about Crazy 8?
Well, you can find me under Michael Jan Friedman at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. You can find me at michaeljanfriedman.net. And also at crazy8press.com.
Thank you so much for being with us, Mike. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we want to thank you for being with us. My name is Ray Schwetz, along with Denisha Boston Hill, your co-host and producers. Visit nccradio.org for more information. We're available on Odyssey, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, as a podcast on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This has been Tower Talk Business Radio, powered by the voice of National Community College, 90.3 WHPC.